We are still, and John's going to be shocked, we're still in 2 Kings where we were when he left. But we're in 2 Kings and we're in 2 Chronicles today. And chapter 14 in 2 Kings is, I guess, where we'll start out. And I ran off and left my pointer somewhere. It must be up there with Kathy yet. But if I could get her to pop up, well, she's even digging out the pointer. Thank you. Let's pop up the map first of all so we can remember where we are. And this morning we're going to be ducking back and forth between both sides of the nation. But you'll remember that Judah is down here, and we've been watching the goings on in Jerusalem and what's taking place there. But also at the same time we've been kind of Roman riding, as they say, with one foot on each horse, trying to keep up with these two kings as the relationship back and forth between the nations has come and gone. And so we'll be looking at Samaria this morning as well, and some political intrigue between those two nations, if you will. And have Kathy pop up the kings so you can get where we are in the lines of the kings. Over here is Israel, and over here is Judah. And we've been through this catastrophe with Athaliah and the near loss of the kingly line through her activities. We are now down here, we're going to be looking at this guy right here, and having done some study and looked at, Brown, Driver, and Briggs is one of the classic Hebrew English lexicons of words and stuff, and they spell out phonetically. If you ever want to know how to pronounce these names, these are really anglicized versions. I've got to tell you, if you go and look up the phonetic stuff, you'll go, how did they even get that? But when you see IA here, you want to think Y-A-W, Yah is more, which is speaking of Yahweh. So anyway, so we've got all these guys, and we're about to move to this guy, which makes things get really interesting. And then over here, we've been through Jehu, who has taken over, passed it on to his son. And I'm not sure, we may get to the third one down here. Probably won't get to Jeroboam the second today, but we're getting close. They're starting to take big steps as we go through this portion of Kings. One of my commentators pointed out that we've been so many chapters covering 90 years with all the stuff with Elijah and Elisha and all that sort of thing. And in the next few verses, you're covering like 60 years in a chapter. So it's just really accelerated through some of these kings. And for reasons only the author knows why he hesitated in some places and not in others. But this morning, I want to pick it up in the very end of 2 Kings 13 as kind of the intro. Last time we didn't quite finish. We ran out of time at the end of Elisha's life. You'll remember that we had that really odd scene where the king of Judah, Amaziah, in our English, came down, heard that Elisha's dying, and this really godless king, at least from the standpoint of the true God, he was sold out to worshiping the golden calves and the worship that Jeroboam had set up way back in the beginning. And he hears that Elisha is dying, and he comes down to pay his respects, I guess, in a way. And we saw this really unique interaction between the two when he basically says, what are we going to do without you? You are the chariots and horsemen of Israel, the one that has preserved the nation. That even this king that really was not what you would call a believer in Yahweh, and yet recognized that this guy played a key role in the survival of the nation and was important. And he was, it's almost like, what are we going to do when you're gone? And so he gets one last, that little snippet of perhaps faith or at least interest in the things of God is answered with the prophecy of the shooting of the arrows. And you may remember he opens the window out towards the east, which is out to, look, I can pop the map back up there, Kathy. Remember, we're in Samaria up here, and east is basically this place right here, Syria. And he's aiming at our old friends in Syria, the ruthless king up there, who is just Hazael or Hazael, however you pronounce that, is giving them a lot of grief. He's really been used, God's used them to discipline the nation, and they've struggled and lost a lot of territory. And they shoot the arrow out to the east, and then he tells him to take all the arrows out of his quiver and says, strike the ground. In other words, shoot them into the ground, shoot the whole bunch. And the king shoots 3 of them, goes, that good enough? And the prophet goes, didn't you really want this? I said, shoot them all into the ground. Shoot them all. Strike it with the ground with all of your arrows. He says, because of your this lack of faith, lack of belief in what God was doing, he says, you're only going to get 3 victories out of the deal. You'll strike Syria, but you won't destroy them. You'll only get 3 times. Which is really interesting, because if you've read ahead, Syria is going to be part of what wears them down, and then Assyria from further east is going to be the one that finishes them off. But if they had destroyed them, you have to wonder what the faith of that king may or may not have changed in the long-term outcome. But he gets that promise, and then in verse 20, Elisha dies and they bury him. And you go, well, that's the end of that tune. That's the end of that story. It's all over. And then there's this little strange vignette they stuck in there. And it's all in those 2 verses. Right after they said they buried him, it talks about the bands of the Moabites would invade the land in the spring of the year. So the Moabites are down here, and they would come work their way back up somehow, push back up. And remember, by this time, this chunk of ground here has been probably taken by Moab and Syria. So anything on this east side of the river, they pretty well lost control of. So whether Syria is allowing Moab to come on up and push through out of their territory towards Samaria, it doesn't tell us where Elisha was buried. Somewhere in the land, but we don't know exactly where. Obviously, it was where the Moabites came calling in the spring. And it says the spring of the year, that's when the ground settles up and the snows have gone away from the mountains, and now you can go out and your military can have some success. That's when the kings went out to war. And the Moabite raiding parties started coming in. And there's this group of guys, and they've got one of their friends or family members that has passed away. And they're packing his body out, it's probably wrapped up in cloths. They didn't have coffins like we did in those days. And they're taking him out to the place where the tombs are, and they're going to bury this guy. And right in the middle of the whole process, the Moabites show up. Now, I don't know what y'all would do if you're out at the cemetery and you see the hordes of the Moabites coming at you with swords and spears, but these guys decided they did not have time to do whatever they were going to do. They need the nearest, quickest place to ditch this corpse they're carrying, their friend, get him buried and get out of there in order to preserve life or get back home and protect your resources at home, something. They were all of a sudden in a hurry. And so in verse 21 there, it says, as they were burying a man, behold, they saw a marauding band, and they cast the man into the grave of Elisha. So what you kind of need to picture is some kind of a cave or hole with a rock in front of it, not unlike we're familiar with the Lord when they buried him and rolled the stone in front of it. And they pushed the stone out, tossed the guy in, and by now we know it's probably time has passed because it speaks of his bones. Now I don't know if that's literal bones or it means on the corpse that was there before, but they had like shelves carved in the rock. And I know if you've seen any of these National Geographic and things, they have these things called ossuaries where they'll bury them, and when the body decays and there's nothing left but the bones, you gather the bones up, put them in a pile in this ossuary, and then you reuse the shelf for the next body, and you just keep stacking the bones in there. Well, the bones were still in the grave, what sounds like anyway, with the body now decayed. So it's been some time since Elisha has been placed in there. And they toss this guy in there to go, and as soon as he hits the bones, he goes, ah! And I imagine they ran faster back home. The guy comes to life. And it says, when the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. Man, that'd get your heart going if you were with him, huh? And then it ends. And you go, ah! So, what's the whole point? Why did they put that in there? What's the purpose of the writers sticking that other than to say, wow, wasn't that great? Isn't that exciting? But then you got to think about what's been going on. Probably, we're several years, probably, at least. I don't know how long it takes a body to completely decay in that country inside of that. But if that's really what it is, and it was his literal, just the bones that were left, we've probably been a couple of years anyway, that body's been laying in there. And during that time, what's been going on in the land? What's been happening up here in Samaria? Well, the king had a promise from Elisha, but it appears that perhaps they haven't been making as much headway as maybe they thought. It could possibly be that this still belongs to Syria and they're still raiding into this, and people are, obviously the Moabites are still coming in. Things aren't secured over there yet. So was that prophecy for real? Had God forgotten them as was Elisha's last prophecy just the ravings of an old man before he died? What was it? And you know, if that's any place like Bickleton, that story went through the community like wildfire. Because everybody ran out. The guy was probably, on the news, interviewed by every press from all around. All the ballad singers going through the town saying about this guy brought back to life, and it had to make its way all the way to Samaria, all the way to the king. Oh my gosh. Elisha's bones even still carry the power of God within them. How much is worth? Was the promises still valid to the nation? And it had to be like a huge heads up that God isn't through with you yet, that the promises through Elisha were going to be fulfilled, and we need to remember Elisha's God. I can't help but believe this was one of those shots across their bow that was to wake them up, and they ought to be listening up. And yeah,
they're so prone to turning away from God and worshiping idols for these kinds of things too, when they want to give up. So
could have been starting to head back to what else was going on. Because immediately it tells about the next verse takes us right back to Hazael and says he had oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz. So man, he just kept right on. And then there's that great word that the Bible uses every once in a while. In verse 23, that first word, but. The Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them and turned to them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them or cast them from his presence until now, or at least even up until now. So there we have an interesting passage. Did you catch how God looked at them? He was gracious and had compassion on them because they were such wonderful people at heart. Because of his word, what he had said, and the promise to the forefathers, I'm not ready to abandon them yet. says, right up till now, I'm not going to destroy them or cast them from his presence. Which is interesting, because when we go back to Deuteronomy and when we go back to Solomon's prayer, it tells us that if they are disobedient, what will happen to them? Yeah, you're going to get thrown out of the land. It says, if you disobey, out you go. And yet he's saying, because of my promise to these three guys, you're not out yet. Isn't that crazy?
Didn't say when.
He didn't say when, he didn't say forever that they wouldn't, that the discipline wouldn't come. But he said, I made a promise, and the reason you have time, the reason why you're still here, is because I made a promise. The law says, you disobey, you're out. But grace says, I made a promise to these guys, and you're still here.
It's still in effect today.
Still in effect today, yeah. He's never revoked that. He says, I made that promise, and I will fulfill it. So there's that little, we had two reminders now. One is the miracle, and the second one is the word that backs up the miracle. If you get to thinking about the impact of these things, is the word's still good, and the miracle is testifying that the prophecy of Elisha is good, and no, Syria isn't going to take you over and destroy you, because the promise to the fathers is still there, and I'm not willing to throw you out yet. And then a little bit of the beginnings of these promises through Elisha happens. In verse 24, when Hazael, the king of Syria, died. There's an answer number one. The man who was prophesied to be the one who would do all this destruction is now gone. And Ben-Hadad, his son, became king in his place. Then Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, took again from the hand, we've down two sons now. Follow that? We went from the one son, he just had battle, he's over the one guy, and now his son takes over, and the other guy's son takes over, and now the tide is turning. And Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, took again from the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities which he had taken in war from the hand of Jehoahaz his father. 3 times Joash defeated them and recovered the cities of Israel. And what we'll find is that they pretty well took back this part here east of the river, and later we'll see, we get that far, we'll see where it talks about clear down to the Dead Sea. So this whole chunk of territory is going to get taken back by Israel, and by the time that Jeroboam II comes along, they'll have that pretty firmly in their grasp. So there's our promises. The 3 times he defeated them, and they recovered the cities. So there's his 3 arrows that he fired, and the promise there. I think reason those are in there is just to demonstrate to us that what God said through Elisha took place. We're probably covered a whole chunk of territory in terms of years right there. But God wanted us to know that. And then all of a sudden we get whiplash, because we are back in Judah in chapter 14. And we have another really interesting guy pops up. So let's pick up chapter 14, and we'll need to read a little bit of this and try to get ourselves, now that y'all just got focused in on Israel and sort of kind of figured out what's going on there, then they pick you up. I better not talk with my hands. Everybody awake now? What can I say? So off we go, back down to Judah. You guys are really confused now. Back down to Jerusalem, where we have had a king down there who started out great as a 7-year-old and went down the tubes rapidly by the time he reached old age. So we're going to pick it up down there. In the second year of Joash, son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel. Okay, got to get this in your mind. Oh, better have the kings back, Kathy, if you could. There we go. So we got Jehu, Jehoahaz, and now we're saying in the second year of this guy right here, Jehoash. And it gets confusing because remember we had this guy here. That was the 7-year-old right there. Now it was 7 when he took over. So in the second year of the guy, king of Israel, Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah. So here we are, Amaziah. This guy right here is in the second year of this guy right here. So you can connect those two fellows right there and try to track them a little bit. And he became king in Judah, and he was 25 years old when he became king. And he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jehoadin of Jerusalem, which I think it means, oh, now my brain's going. God delights is what her name meant. Jehovah delights in her. And it must have had some impact, at least, her name and her who she was, because his dad did not do so well in the end of his reign. But it says, and he did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not like David his father. So he wasn't quite that squared away, but he did according to all that Joash his father had done. Which is, keep that in mind. When you first read that, you think, oh, the good things his father had done. There's a connection here to the two guys that amazingly did do like his father had done. And then there's this little caveat, verse 4, we keep running into. Only the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. We've got rid of Baal, we've got rid of a lot of things, but that one just won't go away. Now it came about as soon as the kingdom was firmly in his hand, that he killed his servants who had slain the king, his father. Okay, now you got to remember, okay, what happened to his dad? Remember his dad had a little problem with folks, and people got upset with him, and so then as he became ill, a couple of his servants conspired, and they did away with him. They killed him as he was sick, and nobody was able to touch him because it was a conspiracy within the palace. Did you catch the part that it said he had to get it firmly in his hand? In other words, these servants were still in the kingdom. They were still in control. And if you've been watching the news lately, and you've seen what was going on in North Korea, where the new young leader in North Korea decided that his uncle was a problem, but now it's been a while since he came to power, and he suddenly has felt secure enough and strong enough that he's going to take the competition out, and he removed his uncle. So his uncle is gone, and he's solidifying power, not unlike what's happening right here. Only the reason he's solidified his power he's got, he knows he can get away with this without those guys bringing that conspiracy against him. And he takes them out because they were the ones that instigated the death of his dad. If you love political intrigue, man, this is full of it. You can just imagine all the negotiations and goings on behind the scenes that must have been happening here. So he killed them, and only there is one thing that gives us a clue that at least his heart was open to God in the beginning, because it says, verse 6, but the sons of the slayers he did not put to death, according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, the Lord commanded, saying, the fathers shall not be put to death for the sons, nor the sons be put to death for the fathers, but each shall be put to death for his own sin. That was contrary to what everything we've seen so far in the nations around, isn't it? Because what did you do when you came in? All those guys over here, when Jehu came in and cleaned house, how thorough was he? Yeah. if you were related in any way whatsoever, you are dead. You cleaned them out. And this guy says, no, those guys did wrong. They murdered my father. However, I'm not going to take that punishment out on their kids, because Scripture says I should not do that. So here's a guy, get this in your brain because it's important later, really started out listening to what the Word said, listening to what God had told him, and wants to do the right thing. We get another little snippet to follow here. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit and flip over to our next passage in Chronicles, because right here in verse 7 it leaps ahead, and I'll just read the leap ahead. And one verse here covers quite a bit of territory. It says, he killed of Edom in the valley of Salt 10,000, took Selah by war, and named it Joktiel to this day. And you go, whoopee, I guess that was important. Well, it was important, and Chronicles, fortunately, if you turn over to Chronicles chapter 25, we'll find out a little more detail about that whole event. And it wasn't quite as simple as it looked like in 2 Kings, and this is where you get a little more insight into this guy, and maybe a little more insight into what the Scriptures are wanting us to understand. And it tells us that starting in verse 5, we'll pick up because the other part is just a repeat of what we just read. In chapter 25 of 2 Chronicles, verse 5, where it says, moreover, Amaziah assembled Judah and appointed them according to their fathers' households under commanders of thousands and hundreds throughout Judah and Benjamin. And he took a census from those 20 years old and upward, and found them to be 300,000 choice men, able to go to war and handle spear and shield. That sounds really good. 300,000, that's a lot of people. If you go back and look at the past musters, if you will, 300,000 is not a whole bunch. And there's a clue there of how badly Judah has been decimated through all the battles and the attacks from outside and all the things going on. Their numbers are down. And he's trying to find out just how secure he is in being able to do what he's wanting to do, what he's got in his mind. And he decides, I think, that that's good, but he doesn't have enough, because in verse 6, he went shopping. And he went up north and he hired 100,000 valiant warriors out of Israel for 100 talents of silver. I need a few more guys. That's not quite enough. I need some security. Plus, you wonder, is this an effort to, as we've seen before, cement some relationships between the two? Perhaps. So he hires these guys, and what you need to understand a little bit now, when you were a warrior and you went to battle, you didn't necessarily get paid a whole bunch. And this money that was paid for those guys, one calculation that's fairly old, but figured out that it was worth $17 to $20 a head, got sent up to the king in Israel for the service of these guys. And the only hope these guys had of any pay was from the spoils of war. You went to battle, you attacked a rich country, you stripped the soldiers of their valuables and got whatever spoils of war you could get, and that was your pay as a soldier, other than your food and whatever they provided you as a warrior while you're on the battlefield. But that, you got to kind of understand that to see what happens next. It says, a man of God came to him, and a prophet, O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you, for the Lord is not with Israel, nor with any of the sons of Ephraim, which is a term pretty much describing the northern kingdom. But if you do go, do it, be strong for the battle, yet God will help will bring you down before the enemy, for God has power to help and to bring down. If you take those guys, you're going to lose. That was the message. Don't take them. God's not happy with that nation. They have rejected him. He is not going to help them, and if you bring them in to help you, you're going to lose. God will discipline you for trusting in them instead of him. And he's still listening. He listened to Deuteronomy, he listens here, and he dismissed those troops in verse 10. Oh, verse 9, I better back up. And Amaziah said to the man of God, but what shall we do for the 100 talents I have given to the troops of Israel? I spent a whole bunch of money on them. And the man of God answered, the Lord has much more to give you than this. Hey, let it go. Just forget it. And he buys into that idea, and he dismissed them. And then it tells us about when these troops, when they went back home, it says the troops which came to him from Ephraim to go home were dismissed. So their anger burned against Judah, and they returned home in fierce anger. They were not happy. Why?
Left everything to fight and didn't bring money.
They didn't get anything. It all went to the king. They got nothing. And they just got sent. They made a long trip down. They got a long trip going back. And so they're going to, in fact, let's go down to verse 13 so you can see how they went back. They were hot under the collar as they went marching home. And they had to go through some of the territory of Judah on the way. And they said, well, we'll get our pay. But the troops whom Amaziah sent back from going with him to battle raided the cities of Judah from Samaria to Beth-horon and struck down 3,000 of them and plundered much spoil. Beth-horon is just the slightly north and west on the highway over to the coast out of Jerusalem. So, our map one more time. If you're going from Jerusalem, there's a highway that goes over to the coast, and somewhere out over here in their territory, so from here to here, it went out here, and anything that had something to do with Judah at all, any connection, they hit them hard. So, that wasn't nice, but that was how they got their pay. Meanwhile, of course, all the troops that would have defended those cities have been gathered up, and we're going to battle. And we're going to go south again. You'll remember this little nation down below here had rebelled in the past when the king was weak, and they took back their territory back here, and Judah got kicked out. And they lost the control that they had, and Amaziah is going to set that right. We got just enough minutes to get through this, and then we'll pick it up next time. And so in verse 11, Amaziah strengthened himself and led his people forth and went to the valley of Salt and struck down 10,000 of the sons of Seir, which is Edom. The valley of Salt is right down here. It is kind of marshy land, which we have seen before. Remember the reflection of red, and the enemy thought, oh, they've all killed themselves into the blood, and rushed in and got ambushed. Well, Valley of Salt again, and they defeated them, killed 10,000 people in the process. And then, if that were not enough, it says that, where am I here? I lost it. In verse 12, thank you. The sons of Judah also captured 10,000 alive. So they took 10,000 prisoners, and they brought them to the top of the cliff and threw them down from the top of the cliff, so they were all dashed to pieces. Now remember, and you probably already forgot, but when we were over there in Kings, it mentioned that the term Selah is where this took place. In Selah in Hebrew means rock, and in particular is the rock. So, picture number one, think this. Good. There we go. There is near the rock. You can see it's pretty tall. And when you go on through that spot in the rock, you see widens out. Oh, here we have a stairway, some old ruins there in this tall vertical cliff type area until you come out to where the city is in the treasuries of, you know the Greek term, Petra, in modern day Jordan, I believe. So here it is. It's somewhat south of the Salt Valley that they had the battle in, several miles to the south. is this place called Petra, or Selah, the rock. And what they did with these guys is took all 10,000 of them up on top of those cliffs and pushed them off, which was a common way of dealing with your enemies in those days. And it just gives you willies and goosebumps thinking about tipping somebody out over. That's a long ways down. You can see those little specks down there, people. That is a huge cliff. So that's how he dealt with those prisoners, and they were dashed to pieces. So, what do we learn from this guy? I hope you begin to see a little bit of a progression, and we're going to see more of it next time when we pick this guy up. He starts out listening to Deuteronomy. He listens to the prophet, and he gets rid of the guys, but he still has ambitions for this, and he's successful in war. And now he's beginning, let's see, how do we deal with these prisoners? Well, what does everybody else do with prisoners? We get rid of them. No mercy, no grace. They're the enemy. You get rid of them. And he renamed that city that we were looking at with a new name, and which tends to tell us that he took over and they controlled that area. But he's starting to use the techniques that the world uses, and what we're going to see is a rapid decline as he returns home with idols that were worshipped by the Edomites and sets them up in Jerusalem. And it's just step right down the path of listening to the world. And a huge heads-up warning to us of how easy it is to slide from listening to Deuteronomy, listening to the Word, to moving over to where the ways of the world sound like a pretty good idea. And we're going to see especially his pride is going to be a huge challenge for him as he comes back from this victory pumped up with how great he is and how good he is. And the thistle's going to holler out to the cedars and say, I think we're equal. So that's a parable or a proverb we'll get to see next time. Let's close. Father, we thank you for our time together this morning, and we spent a lot of time wondering and being confused by this king and that king and the battles and turmoils between these nations and some of the barbarous ways they fought and dealt with one another. Just give us real pause because it's so foreign to our way of thinking, and yet awful things happen in our times as well. And the weapons of war have changed, but the hearts of men have not. But Father, help us to catch at least a glimpse of how the heart can so quickly be taken from those things that were faithful to you and listening to your word and listening to your prophet, to straying further and further away to the point where he could no longer hear your word or hear your prophet. And Father, help us to avoid that pitfall. Help us to find in these stories, if we read them or reread them, the warnings of allowing the things of the world and the pressures of life to cause us to adopt practices that are not approved by you or not blessed by you, but that in our lives we would stay close to you, that we would be headed off when we start going the wrong way. We would have ears open to hear and hearts with desire to listen and obey. Father, give us your blessing today as we continue in our worship time today, and just give us ears to hear your word and give you praise for it. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.